Okay, well, thank you so much, and thank you, Mario, for organizing the panel and having me talk. So perhaps a timely isn't the word I'm thinking of, but a good way to end this session is talking about how to make conferences accessible. And so as Mario described, the evolution of this toolkit, which I'm going to talk about, was from our own personal experience. And it was magnified, not made better, by the pandemic, of how inaccessible conferences are for people with disabilities, particularly people, everyone with disabilities, but this work was done out of our lived experience with visual disabilities. And I will just quickly share that I think the breaking point is we had a conference to talk about conference accessibility at a vision science conference, and it was so inaccessible some of our blind participants couldn't get into the virtual room, and so that sort of tipped us to saying we've got to create that roadmap. We've got to do better. Okay, so we've already talked about how people with disabilities are underrepresented in research, and scientific conferences, I think as we all know and understand, we're here today, are critical in career trajectories, in scientific knowledge generation, in networking. It's a really important place, particularly for our researchers who are underrepresented. But when conferences are made inaccessible, it holds back the participation of many of us with disabilities. So I am a data scientist and epidemiologist by training, so I'm going to talk about a little bit of data first. So in the United States, less than 3 out of every 100 STEM workers have a disability. This is recent data. This is data from the National Science Foundation. I know the director is going to be, Ponch is going to be speaking here next. And what's important to understand is in the US, people with disabilities are the only underrepresented group in STEM that have seen no change in representation over the past decade. So what I'm showing on this slide is a bar graph of that lack of change. In 2011, only 0.9% of the STEM workforce reported having a disability. In 2021, it's 1%, right? So that's a slice of the STEM workforce that less than 3 out of every 10 is a bigger proportion of the STEM workforce. So as a researcher with a disability, with a visual disability, as I described personally my experience with grant applications and barriers, early in my career I was very frustrated. And so I started asking some questions about what was being done in the US and in other institutions to support people like me. I was very naive at the time, admittedly, just joining faculty. And I thought, for sure, there's programs and structures and people are thinking about this. And no, the answer was no, unfortunately. So I did the only thing I knew how to do, which was research. And so I submitted a Freedom of Information Act request. Is there something like that here in Canada?
Yes, there is.
Okay, good, sorry, okay. A FOIA request to get data on the percentage of researchers with disabilities getting National Institutes of Health grant funding over a decade, from 2008 to 2018. I got the FOIA request because I couldn't get it by my many email attempts to get it in other ways. And what the data showed is less than 2% of NIH-funded investigators had a disability, and that percentage declined from 1.9% to 1.2%, and that's what I'm showing in a line graph, over that decade. And so the percentage of people with disabilities in the United States of adults is 27%. So this is way off. It's not even close to representative. So with this information, I was angry, admittedly, and still facing lots of barriers. I've done a lot of advocacy work using data to try and drive change in the United States in our STEM workforce, but then have teamed up with Mahedio and some of my other colleagues to specifically work on how to make science and STEM experiences more accessible for people with vision impairment. impairments. And so, as Mahedio introduced, we established INNOVA, the International Network of Researchers with Vision Impairment, and their allies. And our mission was to remove barriers to the scientific training and career advancement for those individuals, researchers who are visually impaired or blind. And we organized our group sort of trying to get a pulse read of what the biggest barriers are. We certainly had a sense of what ours were, and it was publications and conferences, as we've talked much about up here today. And so we decided in our first task, we were going to try and focus on addressing or tackling the barriers to scientific conferences. And on the slide I'm just showing, that was because we decided it was such a critical network building stage and a place to start. So we created some work groups and did some homework and talked to many researchers with vision impairments and their conference experiences, as well as accessibility experts who also had lived experience. And from that, we developed this toolkit on how to make scientific meetings and conferences more accessible. I'm going to go through what those steps are real succinctly, but to our surprise, it got some attention, and we had requests to translate it. So it is now available in English, Spanish, French, and German, and we are in the process of translating it to Dutch. It is freely accessible, and I do mean accessible, meaning it is in an accessible format. From my center's website, which is disabilityhealth.jhu.edu. You can navigate, our website's accessible for screen readers, but if you want to go right there, it's /research. So what our toolkit breaks down is how, when you're planning a conference, the process of a conference and after a conference, what you can do to think about accessibility. And again, I hope that everyone understands this is all of our responsibility and not just the responsibility of people with disabilities. I'll also add, this isn't just about conferences. This is about meetings, right? I think all of us host meetings with colleagues, invited speakers. So this can be scaled to a big national conference or international conference or even a smaller meeting, these recommendations. So the first is when you're planning, think about selecting barrier-free, or venues with barrier-free access. There's laws and regulations in the US, and I know in Canada, about how to ensure accessibility for people with disabilities, or at least that's the stated goal. It's the basement, not the ceiling, as I think was stated on our panel. So there's work to be done there, but at the least, meet the standards of the law, at the least, and you would be surprised that doesn't always happen. I encourage you to go beyond that, but let's just get there. So second, ensure your websites, your forms, social media, and materials related to that meeting or conference are in accessible formats for screen readers. I would also encourage you to go a step further and think about plain language summaries. Okay. I would also say, and I'm going to go through this quickly, to provide accessible versions of agendas, presentations, maps, and posters in similar ways, and ask people if they need accommodations in the meeting or conference. And then at the event, think about accessibility. If you have name tags, make them large print and in high contrast. High contrast is how my slides are, usually black and white, right, is the highest contrast you can get. Offer tours of the venue to help attendees locate points of interest, help them with navigating. Keep spaces clear to allow easy access. These chairs are a bit of a nightmare, admittedly, and we can go through details. I'm short on time. It's ideal to have captioning and audio description during presentations. This isn't specifically for people with low vision and vision impairments, but it is helpful for so many groups. And then during the presentation, provide accessible copies to any attendees, and keep your slides simple with 28-point font, and use high contrast in the slides too, and give visual descriptions of the images, the videos, graphs, tables, right? Imagine people who are blind in the audience, always. And last, we'll just end that accessibility is key to advancing STEM equity, and it's all of our responsibility. Think about accessibility in conferences, in meetings, in everything that you do. And thank you all for for attending. Woo!
Thank you folks so much. Once again, I just want to thank everyone who is here today for coming to represent yourselves and your organizations with international, national, provincial, municipal reach, whatever it is. There was a lot of really amazing folks who came out today to advocate on behalf of themselves, on behalf of their organizations, and on behalf of a lot of equity-seeking and equity-deserving groups in Canada who we know are underrepresented, particularly in STEM. Can we just get a quick another round of applause for everybody today? For everybody?